بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. As is mentioned by Brother Hudayfa, and did a bit of intro into a bit of my background. Jazakallah khair for that. I won't go into what I do and my passion on history. We have a lot of ground to cover on the subject that we want to sort of explore today. And so I'll quickly dive in without any interlude. So without any introduction to someone, I'm going to quickly dive in. As we said, we're going to be covering what is known as the history of Islam in East Africa, but specifically focusing on the two elements that makes essentially what Islam in East Africa means, which is hijrah and ilm, the journey of knowledge. So the journey of knowledge and spreading knowledge and gaining knowledge and transferring knowledge. These are the two characteristics when people look at in East Africa. Unfortunately, it's not a subject that has been widely explored, but it is a subject which has quite a lot of data to explore in depth. And that's why I choose to look into the subject specifically, rather than sort of rehashing the same discussions again and again, okay? And so we're focusing specifically here on the hijrah in that part of the world, as well as the consequence of hijrah, which is the spreading of ilm and knowledge and scholars and interchanging ilm bi'idhnillah kareem. While I'm doing this, if there are any queries that I need to say, or if you lose me somehow, please remind me bi'idhnillah kareem so that I can go back to it, okay? And it's the subject of tariq is quite a really important subject. So by the end of this webinar, inshallah, what we will understand is and was Islam an early element within the East Africa? So is there an sort of a one-time incident, or is it something that has been there and that has been explored and that has been had a longer run of it? Okay, did Muslim society develop early on in East Africa, and what does that mean? Is it something that what we know about East Africa and when we hear about Islam in East Africa, is there some type of an episode that happened once, and that, you know, where we say the hijrah of Ard al-Habasha, that the hijrah was made to Ard al-Habasha and that was it? And or did anything else come out of there? Okay, and what were the scholarly endeavors locally, and how much of that was entrepreneurial? How much of that focused on an economy and a sort of a platform where people actually earn their livelihood, but not only earn their livelihood, but also actually expanded the horizon of the people that wanted to learn Islam? Was Islamic entrepreneurship what is Islamic entrepreneurship flourished in East Africa, which is sort of tied up with that? And so inshallah we will explore that bi'idhnillah kareem. And did other Muslim scholars travel to study in East Africa? So we always hear about Africa generally, but also specifically in East Africa, that there has been what is known as quote unquote itinerary scholars, which means scholars who've always been on the go, who came to Africa and East Africa to spread the ilm and knowledge. Has that always been the case? Is this how Islam and the Islamic knowledge has spread throughout the East Africa, or has there been a unique signature of Islamic learning and Islamic discipline within that part of the continent? What were the Islamic literary sciences in East Africans excelled in? So what did they excel in? What were these ulum within the, when we look at within the framework of Islamic studies, what we call nowadays Islamic studies, okay? And what pioneering scholars held from this part of the world. So who were they, what did they do, and how did they affect the peoples? And so quickly just talk about the importance of history, that, you know, one of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran is in Surah Al-Insan, هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينٌ مِنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا. Was there not a period of time when man was nothing to be mentioned of, nothing to be mentioned of, i.e., was there a time, do you not ponder, do you not think about that there was no time that you did not have a name, that you did not have a gender, that you did not have a profession, that you were nothing to be mentioned of except what is written with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so therefore history essentially, actually, when we're looking at it, might actually start with what is truly haqiqatan with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? What we call written history, because everything's preserved in Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, right? And or history that we know as the humans, as the things that we learn. So we get to learn elements of knowledge of the past that we were not aware of, that existed, and then we endeavor and we improve on it. And that's what essentially history is essentially, and that we learn from these things. That's why famously Imam Shafi'i has been recorded to have said, Man allama tarikh, and he who learns, or he who teaches. In another way he says, Man qara'a tarikh, he who reads or teaches in another aspect. Or tarikh zada aqlahu, that his intellect or her intellect increases. That person becomes a person with a sort of a magnificent trait, okay? And so everything is sort of linked with us understanding where we come from, who we were, and what lessons we can learn from the past. And that's why the Quran essentially, all these qasas of the Anbiya, all these qasas of the Salihin, all these stories of the righteous people in the past that is mentioned in the Quran, which has been roughly estimated, as scholars have mentioned, such as Hijaz and everywhere else, that 1/3 of the Quran consists of these historical anecdotes, historical stories, or qasas. Why? They're there to improve, so that we can improve of understanding the past, and we can learn lessons from it, and we can build a better day for tomorrow, and so we do not repeat these mistakes, okay? And so that is what essentially these qasas are, and that's why we need to learn tarikh extensively. And unfortunately, Muslims have sort of slacked in that area in the last centuries, and that's why Imam Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, the famous Egyptian / East African scholar, said in his Tariq work, and I'm quoting him here, he says, the people of the past, since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created mankind, took care to write history age after age and generation after generation, until the people of our time, and he's talking about, this is about 2 centuries roughly, until about the people of our time have abandoned and neglected it, okay? And they discarded it and they casted it off, considering it the business of persons without employment. So the mad person, the person who does not has any reputation within the people. And that's what people who love history suffer today, you know, because there is no money attached to it, so no one wants to do it. No one actually goes back to history and learns from it so that they can improve their life on it, you know. And so that's what history has become, unfortunately. So in this part, we were going to cover is essentially 4 to 5 sections, 4 main sections, okay? Section 1 is look at pre-Islam and the dawn of Islam. So the times of before Islam has come to that part of the world, to East Africa. What was the area like? What were the people like? Okay, that's one area. So we're looking at empires, hijrah, and sort of the African Muslim identity that was essentially at the time. Okay, and then we look at sort of ethnography. What do the scholars of Tariq and geography and ethnography, the people who study the sciences of the earth, the people who studies the sciences of the people of the earth, what do they have to say about that part of the world, okay, early on, okay? And then so we look at then section 3, where by now we sort of assess and understand the global East African scholarship, the connection and the network that Muslims have built that came from that part of the world, okay? So what were their reach like between East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, or the Hijaz, Sham, Yemen, and South Arabia, and all that, on those places, and as well as the South Asian part of the world. How do they link up with these things? What do they do, okay? And how do they transfer this knowledge? And in section 4, we look at development of Islamic seminaries, things that Muslims have done in building up centers of Islamic learning around the Eastern African sort of continent, okay? And so, and number 5 is, inshallah, I will conclude with sort of understanding and looking into the decline of the Muslims at the time. So we jump at section 1. What was Islam like? What was the Arabian Peninsula like, as well as the Eastern African part of the world? What was it like just the time of pre-Islam, okay? So we know from the seerah, the stories of the prophetic biography, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we know that just before he was born, about a couple of decades prior, that there has been a massive war that has taken place in South Yemen, as well as the Hijaz area, which we know as Al-Fil. But before we do that, we have to sort of look at how that war came about. At the time, the known world, and I say known world, is the world that a lot of the historians talk about at the time, consisted of 3-4 main empires that vied for power and supremacy, okay? So in the European part of the world, as well as up to Sham, what was it was empowered was the Byzantine or the Roman Byzantine dynasty and empire, okay? And they were essentially Christians, okay? For those of you who are not aware of that history. And then you had within the Persian part of the world, the Sassanid Empire, which was mainly Zoroastrian in terms of religion and practices, okay? And then you had South Yemen, which was controlled by the Himyari Empire, which was essentially Yemenis who were of Jewish background, okay? And so they controlled that part of the world, okay? And then you had in what is now Northeast Africa, what is today known as Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and part of Somaliland. All of that part was controlled by what we know as the Aksum Empire. And the Aksum Empire was, again, empire that was an East African empire, which was of a Christian background. So it consisted of the peoples of the Habasha, the Tigray, the Oromo are latecomers to that part of Christianity, but they're still part of the geographical land frame. Then you have also the Somalis, you have the Afar, you have the you have so many people that are part of that ethnic makeup of the world. And so the Aksumite Empire controlled that part of the world, and they were very powerful in that. And so they were in partnership with because they were Christian, they closely worked with, or sometimes came under, the Roman Empire that ruled Europe, part of Europe and part of the Sham. Okay, and so because that has happened, and they were in control of that, and the Himyaris essentially being Jews, and having within them a large community of Christians, they persecuted them a lot. And so this gave them an excuse to invade South Yemen and Southern Arabia. And so the Aksumite Empire, with support of the Roman Empire, obviously a mental support, diplomatic support, and everything else, invade the Himyar, and then they conquer it. And it's been said in Greek sources that in 525, and this is where we come to, 525 CE, the Aksumite king known as Asbaha, or in Greek sources Caleb, invades Yemen, which was ruled at the time by the Jewish Himyarite king Dhul Nawas, okay? And so it's been said statistically around about 120,000 peoples and animals and livestock and all the things that come with an army and the infrastructure and support system that come with an invading army left much of what we now know as the Adalis post, which is Northeast Africa, as well as the Dahlak area, as well as Zayla, which is modern day Somalia. So all these things, and Berbera as well. And so some of these regiments were of these different people from different backgrounds, right? And so they left and they invaded and they ended up being in Himyar. Now, quickly gonna move on. And so you have to sort of understand, okay, that the landmass we're talking about earlier on, what we were mentioning about East Africa, when we say East Africa, is huge, is massive. It consists of, because I'll be repeating these terms, and for those of you who are not familiar with, so you can visualize yourself. This is the landmass what we're talking about. When we talk about Horn of Africa, we talk about Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, and Djibouti. When we talk about the Swahili coast and the Great Lakes region, we talk about Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Zambia, Malawi, and everything, and Burundi. And then we've got the islands, which is the Comoro Islands, and Madagascar, Mauritius, and Mayotte. So this is, and as you can see on the map here, it's a huge landmass, okay? It covers a lot of people, it covers a lot of different people from different backgrounds, okay? So, but the army that's left essentially left from the northern east part of the world, okay? And so we skip forward to 570 CE, okay? And this time it's known, again, through Sirah, that Abraha is the one that is the governor that is ruling the Himyar, what we used to be the Himyar kingdom, this, southern Arabia. And so the Himyar kingdom ruled by Abraha at the time attempts to somewhat attract and make sure that people going for trade purposes to Mecca and stopping, you know, because when you go to, when you're leaving South Arabia and you want to go to Sham, you have to stop certain cities, and these cities were known as trading hotspots, trading places. And Mecca was one of these major stops at the trade routes. And so he wanting to sort of hijack those trade routes, wanting to divert the religious significance of Mecca, okay, wanted to change and sort of make sure that Sana'a, which was his center, that people can now come to his center of power rather than stopping at what is it called, Mecca. And so he works at that plan, he schemes at that plan, and therefore he puts that plan to motion, and he eventually tries to invade Mecca. And obviously the story that we know of in Surah Al-Fil is revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca, while the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca in a gathering of the Meccans, that surah is revealed. And some of the interpreters say that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil, that, you know, have you not seen how your Lord has dealt with the people of fil, the ashabul fil? Here, it's actually so fresh in people's memory, in people's recent memory, that it's actually reflective to the people who are there and seated, and people who are listening to these verses, to say, yes, we remember how our Lord dealt with the Ashabul Fil, and how how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala helped us gain the upper hand in that regard. And so the Ashabul Fil here in this regard are people who were great, mighty, and they had their elephants, and they had their armies, and they had their infantries, they had their spears. Their whole mechanism was of an organized army, okay? And so when they invaded Mecca, and they were destroyed in a process, as the surah mentions, through Tayran Ababil, flocks of birds that threw stones at them, right? And obliterated them. And a lot of the animals and the livestock and wealth was lost, and a lot of the people was lost. And as a consequence, what happens to any invading, losing power? They move on, or they become enslaved, or they become sort of people who try to vie for themselves and make a living. So a lot of them ended up becoming mercenaries, you know, because, you know, if you have a strong tradition in combat and all this type of area, you try to make a buck with it and living. So this is what has happened, and people moved on. Some people were enslaved, some people became independent mercenaries, and some became traders and became part of the society, and others went back. And so this is what has happened. And we know through these stories that when Al-Jahid goes and talks about what is essentially what has happened in Mecca, and as a consequence of what has happened with Ashabul Fil, he talks about the invasion of Mecca in a boastful way, because he's got a book which is called Fakhr al-Sudan, that, you know, the boast of the Sudan over the whites. And he wrote this book in a period of time where a lot of the black people in Basra and Baghdad, and usually Iraq and other parts of the world, were going through a lot of discriminatory acts. And this is it has its own story and a background story, which I won't go into it at the moment. But he wrote this in this book, and boastfully saying that, and talking about in Yemen and Northeast Africans invading in Mecca, he says, Jahid quotes, and he says, نحن قد ملكنا بلاد العرب, that we have took over the lands of the Arab, without necessarily any of the Arabs taking over our part of the world. Because Jahid, as we know, he comes from East Africa. He's known as one of those people whose father was his generation of his father. He was born in Iraq, but his generation of father came from East Africa as one of those people who was forcefully brought there. So he's talking about when we invaded and took over the land, and we overcame the Nuwas, and we killed the Himyar, but you did not own our lands, and that sort of things. And he says this in a boastful way, because why? So that he can remind the people there in the Arabs. And, you know, you have to remember Basra and Baghdad is the golden age at the time, where, you know, everything and everybody is marveling at the technology and everything. And so this is a consistent thing that people even till there remembered and knew about it. And so, and also these people that were there and fighting, and the losers, the Habashis, or the Aksamites as they were known as at the time, that were lost, are not necessarily always slaves, because everybody always talks about the aspect of slavery, the Habashis that were slaves. But there were Habashis that were regiments, as we said earlier, mercenaries who stayed there freely. They were not slaves. They were not people who, although they've been mentioned in the sources as in a derogatory term, to say, you know, you use these black people in your battles. That's what the Quraysh did when they lost in the battle, the Battle of Badr, and they wanted sort of a revenge. They hired these regiments of Habashis and these Eastern Africans and these black people, and they hired them to fight on their behalf as well. And so we know these stories through the Sirah and the Maqasi. But what we do not know necessarily is that they are not and have not been slaves, because these people are people that have been hired. And so they were people who were brave, and they continued this tradition of actually being part of that, having that strong culture of having to be part of an army. So from there, we know that the tradition is very strong, and the interconnectivity between the Eastern Africans and the Arabian Peninsula is quite strong, right? And so we move on quickly, and then we talk about now the element and the aspect that's related to the first hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, right? And so the arrival of the companions to East Africa starts when the Prophet ﷺ asks his companions to leave Mecca in the dark of night and go to Bilad al-Habasha, because there is a king that is an adil, there is a king who is justice, okay? And obviously the king has by then earned a reputation of treating people of different background, different persuasions, of religious persuasions, people who were good as good. And the story, to understand the story of that king, you have to read more deeply about him. Okay, I would suggest that people read more about him to understand why he had that reputation, because it's not a reputation that just came out of vacuum. Okay, it's not a reputation that the Prophet ﷺ knew himself alone, but it is a reputation that was well earned and that people knew about. And it's also a reputation that earned him quite a bad name with his own clergy, because the clergy was very powerful at the time. The Christian clergy was very powerful in Ethiopia and the Achaemenid Empire. Okay, and so we move on. And so in about 8 years before Hijrah, which is now known as 614th before the Hijrah, the companions leave for the port city of Shu'aibah and near Jeddah, and then they land in Ethiopia, and they which is modern day sort of modern day Ethiopia and that part of the world. And so they meet the Najash, and the Najash is obviously known in the Aksumite sources and Aksumite traditions as King what was his name? King Armah Ila Gabas. But in the Arabic sources, in the Muslim sources, is known as Ashama. Okay, and so Ashama Ibn Abjar is the one that invites sort of receives the companions, accepts them, and obviously we know through the Sirah what happens and how Quraysh comes after them and everything, and they want to send them back, and obviously he doesn't allow them after he's convinced that they are not terrorists, that they are not people who are running away from crimes that they have committed, but rather people who are fleeing for their religion, and they want a place of refuge where they can live in peace and practice their religions, right? And so this is what he allows, and to continue, he earns that reputation, and they stay. And so few months later, we know again from the stories that after have been living there in the with the Habashis, that they hear a story that there's some sort of a peace treaty in Mecca, and that the Quraysh has sort of somewhat accepted Islam or somewhat became lenient towards the Muslim. And so they decide to go back, at least some of them, they decide to go back to Mecca to look at the situation, okay? And they learn in the dark of night, actually, some of them say, okay, we'll go in Mecca just to examine the situation and look at it. And they learn through that this is not true, that these people have not actually accepted anything, and this hostility continues. So they decide to go back again, but this time with a larger group. So a larger group comes back with them from Mecca now to what is known as Aksumite, in the port cities of probably what was Adalis, what was probably Dahlak, Masawa, and later on Zayla. These are the sort of the areas that has been mentioned that the companions radiallahu anhum ajma'in settled, right? And so they leave and then they come there, and then it's been estimated about 100 of them now leave and then they settle. And this is known as the second hijrah of the companions, right? So the second hijrah of the companions, that to leave again Mecca and settle in what is the if my screen's shaking about, to go to Ard al-Habasha, okay? And so the third hijrah was the one that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went for himself and Abu Bakr initially and others, which is the first year of Rabi' al-Awwal, in the 14th year of the hijrah of the prophetic mission, or when the Prophet ﷺ was sent. And so in around about 6th year of the hijrah, which is 627 in the Gregorian calendar, after the battle of Hudaybiyah, the Najashi accepts Islam through a letter that the Prophet ﷺ sends him, and is carried by, obviously, as we know through the Sirah, by Amr ibn Umayyah, that he brings a letter, and the letter, within the letter, the Prophet ﷺ asks the Najash to send back his companions, but also at the same time to embrace Islam, which the king and the noble king accepts his invitation, making him the first monarch to accept Islam at the time of the prophetic mission. And so, and also Islam then boasts that early on arrival of the companions, and where the companions radiallahu anhum lived outside of Arabian Peninsula. And this has lasted, we have to look at like 13 to 14 years roughly, that the companions in their hundreds have lived, and some have children, some have, and the narrative and anecdote has been overwhelmingly consistently same, to say that the Prophet, the companions, when they came and they settled there, they did not spread Islam. They were a sort of a community which was isolated, and they kept to themselves, and they didn't give da'wah, and they lived. And through the seerah and stories and everything else, we know that actually the companions have moved several times, obviously due to conflicts, because the Najash himself was facing some sort of a mutiny within his, as I said earlier on, within his clergy. And so he had to deal with that. But so they moved several times, cities and places that they lived in. Among the places that's been hypothesized that they lived in Zayla, modern-day Somalia. And the evidences for that is Zayla boasts a masjid that is called Qiblatain Masjid, which has two qiblats that not only are seen on the remaining standing infrastructure that is there, but are actually the foundations that archaeologists and others have dug up to look at, that were much older than the building that stands today. Almost nothing stands today anyway, but the foundations are much stronger, and the qiblas are distinctively facing Mecca and Jerusalem, which is an indication that the companions have, or others that have maybe embraced Islam through the companions, have lived and built their places of worship around about there. And so in the 9th year of the Hijrah, 630 CE, the month of Rajab, after 3 years of being Muslim, the king, the Ethiopian king, or the Najashi, dies. Roughly a year and a half before the Prophet ﷺ himself passes away. So this shows you like that close to the time of the Prophet ﷺ that he himself died, and he spent quite a time with his the Prophet's companions and family members of the Prophet ﷺ, and the culture and the link shows that we have had a in that part of the world a close link with the Prophet and his household, as well as the companions and those people who follow them, right? And so we move on to the part of where we have the next episode of the Umayyads. Oh, by the way, to just say that many talk about today that people do not know the king where he was buried, or the king where he is, or his actual identity. It's a lot of doubts have been casted around that, which is somewhat doing an Orientalist move, but it's also ignorance of us of not looking into detailed where and what our history is. But it's categorically shown that Muslims in the past knew where he was buried and his place of buried, which is modern day Tikrit in what is known as Wukro. Okay, and so and it's visited by Imam Ahmed al-Qazi, one of the great imams who spread Islam in northeast part of Ethiopia in the 1550s, 1540s roughly. Okay, and so we move on and we say, and now I'm going to go quickly fast forward because that's just anecdotal data here. In the year of 86 Hijrah, the Umayyads through Hajjaj ibn Yusuf were consolidating their power in Oman and Iraq areas, and through that a lot of conflict happened, and many of these conflicts, what it caused is that people needed to flee these conflicts and find alternative places to live that are not far away from their known world, but also at the same time are not too close of a reach of the Umayyads. Okay, and these people were people who were in opposition to the power of the Umayyads. And Abdurrahman, Abdurrahman Dixon also, one of the things he mentions is that Hajjaj, he crushed the revolt of Abdurrahman ibn Ash'ath, which ended in the 85th year of the Hijrah. And then he went and moved into Oman and continued with his battle. And these are some of the things that caused the battles. Others argue that Hajjaj ibn Yusuf trying to suppress the insurrections in Oman by two brothers caused a lot of these refugees. In either case, whatever the story is, we know for a fact that a lot of these people have left that part of the world to go to Mogadishu, to go to Kilwa, to go to the Swahili coast, the Somali Peninsula, in this part of the world. Okay, and so and so we know through these battles, and also one of these battles is obviously what have happened with Ibn Zubayr's conflict with the Umayyads, with Hajjaj. Obviously, we know that Mecca was bombarded for quite a time by Hajjaj ibn Yusuf and destroying parts of the Kaaba, subhanAllah, so that he can get Abdullah ibn Zubayr out of Mecca and sort of to surrender. And a lot of these conflicts caused that Muslims had to run from this part of the world that they knew, and everybody that either was defeated or had some sort of allegiance and alliance with the opposing power had to leave because they feared for their families and their and their influence and their political power, and so they left and they moved to East Africa. So you're talking about quite consistently many people that are leaving that part of the world. Okay. Those of you who want these slides later on, as I'm going to go fast now, can get it from me after the session, as Brother Hudayfa mentioned earlier on. Okay, so and still during the Umayyad period, we know that not only people migrating to East Africa, but also envoys are being sent to that part of the world. The Umayyads are, for example, sending generals and governors to that part of the world. We know through the Kitab al-Zunuj, which is an anonymously authored work, that and others, and we're referencing this because it correlates with other data that we have. Some of we mentioned, and some of we will mention in the Karim, that Abdul Malik ibn Marwan sends some of his generals to there, one by the name of Musa ibn Umar al-Khathami or Musa ibn Zubair al-Khathami. So it comes in two different names in the manuscripts. And so they send these generals over there to look at, are these people who've been running away, essentially trying to establish a new powerhouse and attack us, or are they just there as the refugees? Are they just there? And also with a new mandate, if the ilm and the knowledge and allegiance of the people is not strong, to have a base there at least, and for people to learn the deen, okay? And so it mentions that people were paying the kharaj, people were paying some people were paying the taxation. And we should not take away from this an anecdote to say the taxation is because something that is always taken from non-Muslims who are show allegiance and alliance to the Muslim state, right? Typically. But you have to remember the context that the Umayyads were very money loving. They were very economic minded. So they would even take jizya and taxation and all this money from people who were Muslims, who they shouldn't be taking this money from, right? Instead of taking the zakah and everything else, who they took jizya from people who embraced Islam, okay? And so this was a tradition that was well popular until Umar ibn Abdul Aziz comes to the scene and becomes the Khalif and abandons that and abolishes that, right? And so people paid the taxation, and it says here that they were also instructed to learn the deen. وعلم الناس قراءة القرآن والدين. It says here that they taught the people the elementary sciences, the Quran, to read the Quran and the deen in essentially. And so we know from there on, exactly from those type of data, that people have become attuned to learning at the time, okay? They've become attuned to learning and learning the Islamic sciences, okay? And so we move on, and then in around about 49th year of the Hijrah, huge refugees leave what we today know as Persia or that part of the world, okay? And again, through conflict and things that has been happening, okay? And these people leave what is now known as Transaxonia, and they move and they again try to settle in the Eastern African part of the world. Again, part of that tradition, following that Hijrah tradition, and they numbered up to 39 tribes of the Shashun Qabail, or the people that essentially came from Shash. Mentions Sheikh Al-Aidrus in his work Bughiyat Al-Amal, which is in the bibliography later on. You get to that and you can look into that, B'inillah Karim. So due to these conflicts, groups of these Arabian refugees, these Persian refugees and everybody else leave consistently, and they consistently go to East Africa, okay? And they do that for the purpose of actually establishing and having some sort of a base where they can either live peacefully or establish an Islamic learning, okay? And so some go to East Africa, and some go to the Maghrib and North Africa. And then through North Africa, we know they end up going and invading the Iberian Peninsula, and they end up going to Spain, and obviously conquering Spain, and that's how the Andalusian episode is introduced into the world, the Islamic rich culture. and that comes through Africa, is through that Maghrib part of the world, but then also to the Mashriq part of the world is to come to at least Northeast Africa, I'm referring to, is to migrated to Northeast Africa. Okay, so it's a lot of that, it becomes a culture of the people. Okay, and so this consistently goes on and on and on and on. And I want to go back to an important episode, to show that early on, even the Fatimids that have made a close link with East Africans, and also the Umayyads who've made a close link with not only East Africa, because we talked about it, but also from East Africa to Bilad al-Sind, to southern Pakistan or South Asia. It's been mentioned in one of the stories that Muhammad ibn Qasim al-Thaqafi, when he was told to invade and sort of squash the Hindu pirates that were there predominantly at the time in that part of the world, and harassing the Muslim traders and everything. He does that in 2 campaigns, which were not successful. And in the 3rd campaign, actually, he does it, but obviously with a huge stock of an army that actually is recruited from East Africa. And that's also something that's not completely underlined and studied extensively in that part of the world. And so, and through the Abbasids as well, we continue. Subhanallah, the Abbasid dynasty, when the Abbasid come into to control the Muslim world, and they conquer the landmass of the Umayyads in around about 132 Hijri, in 750 CE. Abdurrahman, what was it? Harun al-Rashid. Yeah, Harun al-Rashid is the one that actually sends, the famous Harun al-Rashid is the one that sends a regiment of soldiers, but as well as diplomats, to East Africa to look at and take stock of how the Muslims are over there, whether they are actually reliable, whether the people are recognizing their authority. And it's been mentioned that essentially people were, just like they were with the Umayyads, obedient to the authority, and they followed the obedience of the Khalif at the time. But later on, through Harun al-Rashid, people sort of went against and rebelled against his rule for a period of time, and they denied his rule, and then he had to send a regiment to sort of crush that, and that regiment actually stayed behind as well. So again, a consistency of that people that actually moved to parts of the world, and that early on Islamic scholarship and Islamic learning has become part of the landscape of East Africa. Okay, I hope everybody can hear me, inshallah, bi'idhnillah kareem. So, and then at the time, around about that time, mid second century Hijri, 255 roughly to 270 roughly, what happens is then something called the rebellion, Zenj rebellion. And the Zenj rebellion, essentially, mainly Eastern African forced labor, slaves essentially, who rebelled in what was Basra and Baghdad at the time because of the conditions that they lived in. There were not only East Africans, there were some Europeans, some people from Eastern Europe that were part of it, some Turkish, you know, all these people were part of it, but the main stock were Eastern Africans, okay? And that's why they essentially were called the Zenj rebellion, because they were led by them, and they consisted of most of the, and people, Imam al-Tabari mentions in his Tariq that people died in the thousands on a day because the poor conditions that they lived in. And he mentions as a consequence, this is what heralded the demise of the Abbasid dynasty, the Abbasid rule. This was the start of the downfall of the Abbasid rule, because the oppression and the amount of severe oppression that people have to go through. And it's a long episode that has been covered extensively. Okay, and this is a period also at the same time where the Fatimids, who were an Ismaili Shi'is, ruled somewhat the part of Egypt and the areas of the Maghrib and Sudan and Sicily, the Levant and Hijaz. Okay, I'm covering some bit of historical context. Why? Because it's important that we understand the link that these things have. And so these Fatimiyya, the Shi'i Ismaili Fatimiyya that ruled that part of the world, had within their group a group called the Qaramita. And the Qaramita, founded by Hamdan, who was their part and originated basically what is modern day southern Yemen, believed in actually being a militant breakaway. So he's always trying to conquer and fight the Sunni element and conquer part of the Bahrain, conquer part of the Oman and Iraq and Hijaz, and is known also some of the episode that when one of the time that they actually run away with the Hajar al-Aswad, that the black stone, the Qaramita run away with the black stone, and it's been actually gone for some decades until it was actually found and splintered. And that's why actually till today the Hajar al-Aswad is somewhat splintered into certain fragments, because they run away with it. I don't know what they were trying to do, maybe build a new Kaaba for themselves somewhere else. And so this Qaramita was chased after, and they ran away. And as they ran away, they came to what is now known as the modern day Tanzania area. Okay, some others say no, those people who came are not Shi'is, they were Sunnis by then. So, and though they were loyal to the Qaramita, but they were Sunnis. But either case, the way what it was, people run away through those conflicts of the Qaramita being chased after and trying to get their back to East Africa. Sorry, get them chased out of the Hijaz. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly continue. It's been said that some of them, actually a large group of the Shirazis and Persians as well, they left that part of the world. They came to what is now known as Mogadishu. They stayed in Mogadishu place, but because of Mogadishu being at the time an hub of multicultural society, multi-ethnic society, people who are Black, people who are Arab, people who are Europeans, people who are Rumis, people who were from the Indian continent, a lot of a mixture of Sunni environment mainly, right? They couldn't actually settle, and they moved further south to the Indian Ocean, which is now modern day Tanzania, Kilwa, and part of Kenya. And they are the ones that they say have founded the Kilwa Sultanate later on, that would become one of the most powerful sultanates in East Africa. And obviously some scholars have said that that this is just a bunch of refugees, not necessarily sultans and whole hegemony of a powerhouse that have moved from that part of the world, but moved to southern the Swahili coast. And this is what forms basically what we know as the main hub of the Swahili tradition, language, and culture, because of the vibrant of mixture of the Arabic language with the Bantu peoples of their languages, and all these things gives rise to the Swahili culture. Okay, and so Muslims then essentially become really interested. Early on, not much interested in that part of the world, but later on they become very much interested in that part of the world. So they start writing on it. Okay, and so we talked about the Abbasid, early on the Abbasid dynasty, which is known as the golden era of Islam somewhat, that a lot of the Greek material have been translated and rendered into Arabic, and sometimes commentated on some, but for the most part, what they did is they just rendered an Arabic translation rather than a commentary and an annotation or updating here or there. Some scholars would later do that, but mostly initially they would just translate the work and make it widely available. And so some of these early works also, it's not only philosophical works, but also geographical and ethnographic Greek sources, such as Ptolemy's geography, which is very famous geographical work that has been widely used at the time in the ancient world. Okay, and so this is Muslims actually start focusing on and writing a lot of these materials. And so some of the first ones are Al-Fazari, Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Yaqubi, Al-Khuradabihi, Al-Istakhri, Al-Mas'udi, Al-Maqdisi, and so on and so on. Al-Biruni, who is a brilliant, not only geographer, but also someone who writes a lot on gems and things that you basically is found in the East African landmass in terms of stones and everything, okay? And so Al-Bakri, Al-Idrisi, Al-Yaqut, Al-Hamawi, and you name it, all of them, all the major sources that we know today in terms of Islamic geography, ethnography, historiography, history, are all covering. And I stopped here until Maqrizi because that is one of the last great ones to write in that part of the world, consistently in various works that he wrote in what is essentially 1480s and somewhat, okay? And so there's so much work that has been written around that part of the world, and almost all of them talk about the ethnicity of the peoples that live that part of the world, their religious convictions, and their landmass and their cultures and that type of things, and their food appetite and the products and the economy. So the further the historian is in terms of a timeline, the more material he had to accumulate and add into his works. Although some of them were armchair historians where they really didn't do much of a work, they just had access to work and they copied it and pasted. But that itself was rich, because a lot of these works that they copied and pasted have been subsequently lost, and so they are the only sources that we have for them, okay? So I'm gonna move on, I'm not gonna stand still on this, because we have to go to the largest section where we're going to talk about it. Inshallah, I will do that in the next hour. So as a consequence of interest of scholars writing on that part of the world and covering that part of the world, we have many dynasties that come as a consequence, okay? And so these dynasties get covered as well. So these dynasties are talked about as well extensively. So in what we know today as modern Ethiopia, we have essentially about when we say Ethiopia, modern Ethiopia is this, if you imagine the borderlines, that is modern day Ethiopia. So whether you talk about where the Somalis live, where the Oromo live, because Oromos live a huge chunk of the landmass, the Somalis live another huge chunk of the landmass, and the Tigray and the Amhar and the Beja, and all these people, they live in a huge part of the landmass. But these are ethnic groups that are very distinctively have lived that part of the world for thousands of years, okay? They're not newcomers, and they haven't been moving around as modern European scholarship would have us believe. And so the Sultanate of Shiwa or Shawa or Showa have been around since early on, and they are replaced by the Ifat dynasty, which are essentially the Walashma dynasty, as they're known as, a family line of warrior imams, as well as people who were righteous and who concerned about their deen and spreading the deen. So these sultanates, they increase and they increase and they increase. And I put them in modern day states because it's not fair to put these things in a modern day state lines, but that's how we geographically can orientate ourselves today. But there are a lot of these things were based on ethnic lines. So people who lived in, for example, Wollo were known as people who were from Wollo, and you couldn't confuse the two, and you couldn't confuse in terms of ethnicity, although people have linked, people have lived multicultural cities and city-states, right? But the regions where we're talking about of power and regions that they controlled was essentially people who were in terms of ethnically about the same background, okay? And so these are the sort of things that we have. In Eritrea, we have the Sultanate of Dahlak. In modern day Djibouti, we have the Jura and others that are not named. In modern day Tanzania, we have the famous sultanates of Pemba. We have also in Kilwa, the modern, in Kenya, we have Kilwa and Pate and Mombasa. And in what is now known as modern day is Somalia or Somali Peninsula, we have so much of these dynasties that have barely been covered. And I'm telling you all these dynasties and their distinctive powerhouses because they are centers that were based on Islamic identity. And we have to understand this really, really carefully. They are not centered around what we today know as national, modern national phenomena, and national identity. There is no national identity. The national identity that was known at the time was based either on ethnic line, which we just mentioned earlier on, okay? So the people that talk like you, people that culturally as similar as you, they might not be physically looking the same, but you culturally somewhat the same, you share the same things, and linguistically you share the same languages, but also what ties you is the Islamic identity. And that's why most of them are related to an Islamic identity somewhat, okay? And so these people and these states have been widely covered in sources, and not necessarily detailed, but in glimpses and episodes. The work that Hudayfa mentioned earlier on that I was translating and still, inshallah, almost done and annotated for the last 4 or 5 years is Imam al-Maghrizi's famous work, Al-Ilmam. Al-Ilmam, it talks about at least 7 or 8 two dynasties and powerhouses of Northeast Africa that were Muslim, that vied control and supremacy with the Christian Solomonic Empire that was based in Northeast Ethiopia, now what is today Tigray and Amhara area, okay? So these are very important things to understand. These are very important states to learn and how they came about and how they formed centers of Islamic learning and why they became very crucial and important and why were they found? Why do they have that Islamic identities that they have, okay? And so we look at, as a consequence, what is born out of that is obviously, as we said, the identity, the Islamic identity that ties them together, moves on to developing a network of scholarship. And this network of scholarship is really, really its strongest in the time of the Mamluk era, in the time of the Mamluk era, okay? And which is around about after the Ayyubid dynasty goes out of the scene, and the Mamluks are introduced, and around about between 650, they say, until 850 is considered the second golden age, because we talked about that in the Abbasid era is considered the golden age of Islam at the time, somewhat, but also this is somewhat considered the second coming of that golden age, because the amount of works that have been produced, the amount of work that Muslims have done, the biographical works, the fiqh works, and the hadith works, and the hadith fuqaha, and the tarajim, and the tabaqat, and subhanallah, the ilm al-rijal, and all the mustalah hadith that we practically study today, all traced to that period. And it's really important that we understand also that within that network, the East Africans are not absent, okay? And not only absent because they are a critical element within that. And unfortunately, this is not identified and not talked about at the moment, okay? And so we move on. And so this is the golden era, which we said, although with everything that's happening and these beautiful things that we mentioned earlier, also at the same time, there is quite a lot of, what do we call, destructions and plagues and wars and famines that are going on in the background, okay? Which is, subhanAllah, to say the least, very, very problematic. Okay, but at the same time, with all these challenges, a lot of things are developing. Okay, and so we have the Bahri dynasty, or the Bahri Mamlukis that are known as the Bahri Mamluks, who were Turkish slaves at the time. They ruled around about 648 to 784, replaced the Ayyubid dynasties. Ayyubis are somewhat considered what Salahuddin al-Ayyub and his family left behind. The Kurdish element of that Muslim powerhouse, right? Who vanquished the Crusaders, who put the crusading element almost non-existent at the time. Although there were some Crusaders left, but their really power was destroyed at the time of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And so after this, the Ayyubis go out of the scene in Syria, Dimashq or Sham, and Egypt, and these are two places where Muslims were controlled predominantly from, and Ayyubis leave those power vacuum. The Bahris come in, and the Bahris are not foreigners, so you shouldn't, if I'm making it out look like out like that, I apologize, but they are actually within the forces that the Ayyubis have been using, okay? Somewhat rebelling, somewhat couping, and taking over the power from the Ayyubis. And it's really important that we also understand there is an episode that happens just prior to Salahuddin al-Ayyubi getting control of Egypt from the Fatimids. So the Fatimids, we know they're the ones that built Al-Azhar, okay? And so when they built Al-Azhar and everything else, and they controlled that part of the world, as we mentioned, up to Sudan and places like that, what happens is Salahuddin al-Ayyub as a general is sent to Egypt to take control of Egypt and remove the Fatimids, who are essentially Shias, as we mentioned earlier on. And so he does that. And once he does that, they put in his place a general, and they move on. And then within this, within that short period of time, an African, an East African general who was the right-hand man of the de facto leader of Egypt, coups the state and becomes in control. Him and his army, massive army that he controlled, which was again East Africans of Habash background, Northeast Africans and whatnot, they coup the state and they take control of it. And so again, the Ayyubis have to now interfere and sort of put the power balance back in order. And as such, what it does is then it creates a vacuum where all these blacks, who essentially one line as an ethnic group, are now fought. This is what Imam al-Maghrizi mentions. They are fought, and they are so much fought that a lot of them die as a consequence, as Imam al-Maghrizi said, to the point that the power shifts now to the Turkish force that were there, okay? The Turkish forces that were there, who were part of that army infrastructure. And so they get out of the scene, and they become more dominant. And so this is how the Mamluk, the Bahri, and the later on, what we would see, these what we call the Circassian, the Mamluks that can come later and take control, okay? And so they take control in Egypt and Sham. They become the dominant powerhouse, and they rule. And obviously we said plagues, wars, famines, crusaders happen, but at the same time, all these beautiful things are happening. It's knowledge exchange, you know, ilm transfer, people traveling from one point to another point, okay? And in Damascus, we have traditions where many Eastern African scholars spent in Sham, in Hijaz, in Yemen, and what is called as Iraq and that part of the world. Okay, they keep coming in these places, not only to learn, obviously a chunk of them want to come and learn, like the Talabat al-Ilm do, and they travel, and you know, you have to increase your knowledge, you have to travel. But they also, some of them are senior, they come there to spread their knowledge, you know. And one of the reasons that people travel places to spread knowledge is if they find in a locality that they find themselves at, that there are not enough people tapping into their resources. They most of the time, scholars tend to move on. Most of the time, scholars tend to go to places where the exchange is somewhat different, the environment is somewhat different, and that you might add something to the landmass. Okay, so we see, because that happens in Syria, for example, we see in the Jami' al-Umawi that there early on there is a riwaq that's built, some sort of a college. And because the Jami' al-Umawi is that masjid which till today stands, standing at the moment, where people of different background came to study and teach, right? It was an Islamic seminary which was very important and central to the Muslim world, okay? And so they had a riwaq, they had a college and a segment, an area where people of Northeast Africa stayed. They're called the Zayali'. The riwaq is Zayala, the people who came from Zayla, i.e. modern day Somalia. And later on, they will call it riwaq Jabartis, people who came from modern day Eritrea, modern day Ethiopia, and modern day Djibouti. These parts of the areas of the world that people that came from, they built these riwaqs and this identity of having their own centers within centers. So colleges within centers, as it were. And so we know that around about this period, we're talking about 650 early on, because we're talking about the early on presence of the Mamluk period. We want to start with the Mamluks, okay? And so it's Ibn Salah, the father of Mustalah Hadith, as they call him sometimes, you know, because he wrote that brilliant work of his Muqaddimah, Muqaddimat Ibn Salah, and various other ulum of hadith and fiqh and tabaqat, specifically Shafi'i tabaqat and stuff. And so all these are the things that scholars are pioneering at the time, and they become the critical scholars. And we know around about this time is when Imam Ibn Salah passes away, because there's a huge conflict going on in Damascus. In Dimashq, and Imam Nawawi arrives around about the same time, give or take 5-6 years, he arrives in Dimashq. And so as some are arriving from other parts of Sham, from other parts of Yemen, and from other parts of the world, and to study and exchange knowledge, same is done by Northeast Africans and East Africans arriving in Dimashq and wanting to either gain knowledge or spread knowledge, okay? And as we mentioned earlier on, that many people also at the time died around about that time in Dimashq because of the plight that was happening, the Mongols and the Tatars who come to the scene and pillage and destroy Dimashq. And they said there's so much destruction that a lot of people actually had to move out and move to Cairo en masse, basically. And so we know from this time period that one of the scholars that Imam al-Dhahabi mentions in his Mu'jam al-Kabir, Mu'jam al-Shuyukh al-Kabir, that he mentions that Ibrahim al-Habashi, he calls him al-Habashi, who is an Abyssinian, okay? He says he came and settled in what is now known as Qasiyun area, okay, in Damascus, and stayed there for a period of time. He does not tell us exactly when he came and settled, but he tells us that he came and settled there and established himself at a senior age when he was a scholar. And this is when he spread ilm and knowledge, and Imam al-Dhahabi mentions himself as having studied with him, okay? As having studied with him. And he mentions he's one of those people who suffered under the Tatar, Allah yarhamu, and he died as a consequence of starvations. And we know, again, as I said, many people died due to starvations and these conflicts and destructions, okay? And so from there, we already have an episode of great scholars arriving in Sham and spreading knowledge, and then bang, immediately getting reputations, and then, subhanallah, as a consequence, despite the conflict that is going on, okay? And we can imagine that these people have come and settled in these riwaqs we mentioned, these colleges we mentioned, to spread knowledge. And so another scholar that is mentioned, Imam Shamsuddin al-Maqdishawi, al-Shafi'i, who was a Shafi'i himself, roughly born about 648, around about the period where the Mamluk era comes to fruition, but also dies around about 718th Hijrah. And he was born in modern day Mogadishu, sometime 648 Hijri, 1250. And he studied hadith extensively. Subhanallah, Shamsuddin came from Mogadishu, went to India, went to Iraq, went to Dimashq, and performed Hajj many times. Imam al-Dhahabi mentions him, that he studied with him the Hadith al-Bukhari and various other books, okay? He says, Hajjam Marratin wa Jawara, and that he stayed in Mecca for a period of time, and that he did his Hajj in Mecca for a period of time. Give me a second, I'm just gonna put my charger in the laptop. And so these are some of the stories that we have from these scholars, right? Subhanallah, that they have spent so much time in acquiring knowledge and going around the world and then settling in different parts of the world. And so it's very strange that in a time where conflict is happening, in a time where starvation is happening in a period of time, because it's not like people are ignorant of it, but people are pushed by their hunger for ilm, to learn and to spread knowledge, you know, to give that wajib that is bestowed upon them, to transfer that knowledge, okay? So Shamsuddin al-Maqdishawi travels to India, as we said, he travels to Iraq, he travels to Dimashq, he travels and performs Hajj many times, and he stays in Mecca. And Imam al-Dhahabi mentions and continues, he transmitted hadith from Imam Kamal al-Din al-Dakhmisi, or al-Dahmisi, depends on how you pronounce it. In the Mu'jam works, as well as in the Tabaqat works, he has a different wordings. And this individual, this scholar, Al-Hamawi, who is somewhat either of Turkish background or a Greek origin, somewhat, is actually a critical person. He's a really important figure because he himself also travels to India. He himself travels around the world to spread and study the Bukhari from a variety of scholars. And he becomes a crucial link with people like for Imam al-Dhahabi to get the Bukhari as the highest somewhat sanad that he can get, but also the best of the renditions of the Sahih al-Bukhari that he can get. So al-Dhahabi narrates from Maqdishawi in the year 710. He mentions him himself, I narrate from him in the year 710, or he gave it to us hadith in the year 710, in Hadith al-Bukhari specifically, which was 1310 Hijri. At the age of 37 years old, roughly, is when he transmits this hadith. And so al-Maqdishawi, then also he mentions, then had this hadith that we are taking from, and this transmission of Bukhari from Dakhmisi in the period of 670 in India. So in there he mentions that he took it from this knowledge from him in India in around about 670. This is an amazing anecdote, and is really important information because it shows you the wide transfer that the knowledge goes from South Indian part of the world and South Asia part of the world, all the way to Syria, all the way to Dimashq, okay? And not by anybody else, not by people from Dimashq, not by people from India, but people that are actually from either what is known as the Greek part of the world, but also from the East African. So whites and blacks here, essentially. And this is a really important anecdote to stand still on, okay? And then we can also follow the same story with Muhammad al-Shams al-Zayla'i, who was born in Zayla and traveled to settle in Dimashq. He became an expert calligrapher. He copied over many volumes of religious sciences ornately, and he was known to be so good and so widely celebrated and amassed a fame that many people actually traveled specifically to learn his style of khat, all right? So biographers have mentioned that in his time, he taught so many that everyone worth the name of al-katib, or the person who writes, and a person who photocopies, and a person who works in the industry of manuscripts and makhtut and literature. Anybody that was known at the time with a reputation would be linked with him as a student. And this is quite saying a lot. And one of his senior mashayikh, one of Muhammad al-Shams al-Zayla'i's senior mashayikh was Ibn al-Qamah. And Ibn al-Qamah, subhanallah, who was a senior teacher, used to boast that he studied with Shamsuddin al-Zayla'i, to the point where they say that he preferred his own students' knowledge and transmissions and writings and acumen over his own self, okay? And so this is mentioned by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani extensively, and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani writes a beautiful entry about him, and so does his student Imam al-Sakhawi in Lu'ul Lami'. They both write about him, and they detailed about this, and they mentioned that specifically that many people have studied with him. As I said earlier, تعلم الناس منه وأخذ عنه غالب أهل بلد, that most of the people from Sham, they took it from him, okay? And that when انتهت إليه رياسة الفن, that the fun, this specific science, literally they say to the point that it ended with him, like the acumen, the knowledge of the science ended with him. And he was of the Hanafi background, subhanallah, in terms of fiqh and madhab that he mentioned. And so we move on. And in terms of people, again, in Dimashq, a century later or somewhat, or almost a century later, we have and I wrote about Khadija on my timeline earlier on, several months ago, that Khadija was one of those people who studied hadith and ilm hadith extensively. Okay, Khadija had hadith from Jamal al-Hanbali, and he was given, she was also given ijaza by Aisha bint Ibn al-Hadi. And Ibn al-Hadi, we don't need to introduce him. Anybody who knows ilm hadith, anybody who knows Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah alayhim, all of them, that have this extensive knowledge of hadith. Specifically when we look at Sahih Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari is a really crucial person when you look at Ibn al-Hadi. Not necessarily that he himself is a crucial link and that people chase after, but the environment and the seminary around him that is built around Ibn al-Hadi. If you look at the biographers a lot, you will say this person studies with Ibn al-Hadi. This person is the student of the daughter of Aisha, the Aisha Ibn al-Hadi, and so on. It continues and continues. He was a great Hanafi scholar, Hanbali scholar, and he was a great scholar in transmission of ilm al-hadith, and he was widely celebrated for that. And so his daughter is a crucial link of that, and many people who actually study Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, again, seek her out, seek Aisha out. And Aisha is known to be a person who is the musnadah of the world, as Imam al-Sakhawi puts, the person who everybody in the world comes to for the change of transmission in that regard of hadith and Bukhari. And it's known that she had, at her time when she was alive, there was no chain that was longer than hers. That's literally the claim that has been put forward, that her line was the highest. And so Khadija essentially studies with this scholarship and graduates. And again, and at a young age specifically, Khadija studies at a very young age with her, with Aisha. And so because she studies with Aisha at a young age, when Aisha was young herself, it's amazing that people then, Aisha's senior age, when she studies with her senior age, that people actually appreciate the link that these two have. And so within a century or two, you're only, roughly 2 centuries, you're dealing with 2 people in a chain of transmission, where you normally would end up dealing with 4 or 5 when you try your best and getting the hadith chain of transmission, okay? And so Aisha had also a sister called Fatima. She was also a hadith scholar. And so these people came from a family of scholars, okay? So Khadija studied with these people, and I'm not gonna go back to it. Anybody who wants to look into Aisha's importance in hadith transmission and what she means to the Bukhari that we actually have today, and it's printed again, the versions that we have, the makhtut that is relied on, and what Aisha means in that regard, should actually look into what's his name, the canonization of al-Bukhari by Jonathan Brown, but also our Sheikh Akram Nadawi, Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadawi. If you look at his work in Muhaddithat, and you will learn that the importance of these individual figures, that the women's hadith scholars of Sheikh Akram Nadawi and what he talks about. Okay, so but I'll move on because I've got alhamdulillah, I'm good on time. So I'm gonna move on. And so Khadija traveled and spent some time in Mecca after Hajj, and later on she came to Jerusalem. And so she settled in Jerusalem, and her father was a senior scholar who many people sought after, and they traveled. And I've specifically chosen not to cover her father, because I want to focus on her, because she has a broader scope of a network than her father. Although her father is the point of exposure to her of knowledge, because a lot of people came to her father to get ilm from and study with, like Aisha had that network with her father, Ibn Abdul Hadi, right? Same thing with Khadija. Her father, Faraj al-Zayla'i, is the guy who gets that network. But I specifically chose her because she had a wider network of muhaddiths, people of lugha, people of various funun, various sciences that came under her and studied with her, included with Suyuti, included Sakhawi, included you name them. At the time that we're talking about, the period of the Circassian Burji Mamluks, she was the name that you needed to get to study with, okay? Okay, and so we move on from Sham and Ard al-Sham and Palestine and Jerusalem, and we move to areas of Mecca. And I'm going to choose 2 case studies here by the name of Sulaiman al-Maqdashi, or Muqdashi, of Mogadishu, who died around about 770 Hijri, which is 1369. Okay, and Sulaiman al-Maqdashi also settled in Jerusalem, but he came via Mecca. So he was a production of Hijazi scholarship. So by the time he settles in Jerusalem, he's already built a reputation in Mecca and Medina, okay? And obviously he left in Mogadishu as a senior age, as someone who is established, okay? He stayed in Mecca around 20 years, and he got married to the point, and people knew him, and he was celebrated. The lay people as well as the scholars knew him. That's what Al-Fazi Al-Makki says in his Al-Uqad, and that these people that were at the time in Mecca and in Jerusalem and in Medina, they widely knew him, and he is a person who was known as one of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with many karamat, but he's also a person who extensively studied and extensively taught in all across the funun and across the subjects and sciences. So he traveled a lot, and We do not know why he settled in Jerusalem, but we do know that he had a family and he married to the daughter of one of the emirs in Mecca and Medina, and he moved on, okay? Again, we have a person by the name of Sa'id of Mogadishu. We do not know when he was roughly born or died, but we do know roughly that he was alive in the year 744 Hijri, 744 Hijri, and I'm just gonna put that down, give me a second. Around 744 Hijri, Sa'id of Mogadishu was alive, because we have stories from him that we have is through Ibn Battuta, Allah yarham. And Ibn Battuta mentions that he met Sa'id of Mogadishu around about 744, as we said, in what is today South India, in a town called Hilli. He says, I met him, okay? And he says, I met him in a masjid, a jurist, a pious jurist from Mogadishu called Sa'id, who was a salih, he says. He was a person who was righteous, and he fasted continuously, Siyam al-Dahr, as is known as. And he says, I was told that he had studied in Mecca for 14 years and for the same length of time in Medina. And that's quite a long time. 14 and 14, that is 28 years. And so in totality, 28 years before he ended up in South Asia, or later on in China, okay? Because he would end up going to China, Sa'id of Mogadishu. And so this shows you the network of knowledge and those transference, and that he chose, maybe he moved on later on, but from what we understand the story of Ibn Battuta, that this scholar was a senior scholar at the time, and because he was a senior and high age at the time, he chose to probably live and die in South Asia, and he became part of the landmark in South Asia. And that's not something new. Scholars have done this in the past. And so it says here 14 years and 14 years, that's 28 years in combined bit. But also it mentions that he had a close link with the emirs. He had a close link with Abu Numay, the emir of Mecca, who ruled around about 1254 till 1301. And Mansur ibn Jamas, who is the emir of Medina. And he had a close link with these people. And then he said he moved to India and afterwards to China, right? That's what Ibn Battuta says. And this is through the story that the Sheikh Sa'id himself tells him. Now it's really important because we have to stand this Emir of Medina, by the name of Ibn Jamas, later on ends up having a conflict with his family and ends up being chased away, and he ends up being in Mogadishu. So he ends up being running away and ends up in Mogadishu, and a delegate was sent after him to sort of take him back or whatever, and he realizes that in Mogadishu he's not safe, and he goes further south and goes to Zanzibar and what we now know as a Zanzibar area and stuff, and he tries to make himself known, and he spends time with the Sultan there and being under the protection of the Sultan there. So it's very interesting that these networks of scholarship, networks of dynasties was early on established and early on popular and known. Just like we know where to go when we want to study certain sciences and we want to earn money and we want to go after economic well-being and stuff. And so that is the Arabic text. I should have brought that up earlier on. So yeah, that's what Ibn Battuta mentions, and the Imam, he mentions that he, that it's been mentioned to me that he stayed in Mecca. Let's see, did I skip anything? Looking through the Arabic. Yeah, no, I haven't. So yeah, I've translated the way it was. So yeah, he spent time in Medina and in Mecca and in India and in China. And that is subhanAllah, that is a complete amazing achievement. And this achievement shows, and this extensive network, as we mentioned earlier, shows that scholars had this link with the leaders and the emirs extensively, and they served in sometimes in whatever capacity in their political empires, but also they advanced a knowledge of the people. Okay, and so so we know that he is a well-traveled scholar, known in the world, in the ways of the world. This is where also Ibn Battuta gets the idea to travel to China, because although he was thinking about traveling to China, essentially he gets quite a lot of information, and he's get informed by Sa'id of Mogadishu, the details of China and who rules China and who is the current head leader, and the where to go, where not to go, what to avoid, you know, what places to settle, what pirates to avoid, because, you know, Ibn Battuta had a lot of problems with pirates and people trying to rob him off or get him, take him for prisoners. And so these are the informations that he needs, and to the point where certain European scholars and historians mentioned that Ibn Battuta never traveled to China. He incorporated within his work the anecdote that Sheikh Sa'id of Mogadishu told him, and he used that anecdote and information, and he said, I traveled to China. Okay, and he's been very, and although that is a bit exaggeration and bit of far-fetched, it could possibly mean similarly, but or it could mean on the part of Ibn Battuta that Ibn Battuta made mistakes, because it's mentioned that some of the sources, the Chinese sources, mention certain leaders being in place at the time when Ibn Battuta supposedly comes into China, and which Ibn Battuta claims otherwise. He mentions other leaders in that regard. So this is one of the arguments that's been put forward, but nonetheless, that shows you the impact that Sa'id of Mogadishu had on that part of the world, not necessarily only the world, but scholarship as well. And obviously teaching in that huge masjid in Hilli, which was a massive masjid, which was a center where people who go to South Asia and China, but leaves East Africa settle, and they prayed and stuff. And he even mentions, and Puta mentions, this is not a place only for Muslims, but even he says the pagans and the Hindus and others use this place as a place of refuge and a place to settle. Okay, where was I? And so, yeah, it's also mentioned that obviously within that network is the link that and the scholarship that Sa'id of Mogadishu has linked up with. And we know from this that Sa'id Mogadishu at the time, Mogadishu was predominantly Shafi'i madhab, and Ibn Battuta mentions it as well. And we have in all the data and records, whereas some Hanafis consisted in Northeast Africa, but the Eastern Africa part of the world, the Swahili part of the world, is predominantly have been a Shafi'i world, and it's been later on that the Maliki has, as soon as the Oman areas has been a consistent traffic, the Maliki has been introduced into that part of the Swahili world, but predominantly it's been a Shafi'i world. And so it's been mentioned that the work that one of the first works to be written in that part of the world, which is known as Qaidul Jami', which is a smaller Shafi'i fiqh manual from the Malabari scholarship by the name of Faqih Hussein, was also probably in collaboration with Sa'id of Mogadishu in producing this work, and probably through the influence of Sa'id of Mogadishu. This is what some of the researchers and historians have claimed, and as I put the notes and the evidence, and you can understand this is not far-fetched anecdote because the exposure of the link of scholarship, right? Now we move on to the Hanafis, the huge Hanafi pillars of the Hanafi funun, especially the Hanafi fiqh and Hanafi Takhrij al-Hadith. Well, is the pillar of that world that comes from that part of the world, East Africa, is Imam Fakhruddin al-Zayla'i. Imam Fakhruddin al-Zayla'i, by the name of Uthman ibn Ali, who wrote a beautiful sharh on Nafs Safis Kanz al-Daqa'iq, right? Yeah, Kanz al-Daqa'iq. So yeah, he called it تبيين الحقائق شرح كنز الدقائق, and this is the work that is being produced by him. And so this is a famous work and a famous Hanafi scholar. Not much of his early life is documented, but from the anecdotes and stories and the people that we mentioned earlier on, and the timeline and the people who we've got in the period, we can sort of estimate the environment and the Islamic seminary that produced him. He was of the Hanafi luminaries. And although not much is mentioned, as we mentioned earlier on, the problem has been that there are no early Hanafi biographical tabaqats, you know, the tabaqats of the work. And essentially all the tabaqats have actually had this consistent tradition where they mostly produced around about 650, 750, 850, and around about 9th century Hijri, and so on and on and on. But essentially, the tabaqat works, the tabaqat curriculum, the works that are designed for biographical layers do not become really dominant until those sort of period. Then it becomes a massive production. And the Hanafi were slow to produce that element, as one of the scholars mentioned, which I've mentioned in my proof. Apologies, I've got the sun in my face. So historians mentioned that he entered Cairo around about 705, which is 1306. He taught and spread fiqh, and he benefited the people. Ibn Hajar mentioned that he benefited the people. He was a pillar in Islamic sciences. And he's also traveled to the Hijaz, and he taught in Mecca for a period of time. Again, another link with people going to Hijaz and Mecca and teaching. And this is mentioned by his student Badruddin Thimawana, okay? By the names, there's various ways of spelling his name. So this is one of his students who studied with him in Mecca, who mentions that I studied with my sheikh in Mecca, and I got from him the knowledge of Mecca. So he taught many people in Mecca. So at the time, we know, before he even ended up in Cairo, that he was a senior scholar in Mecca and teaching some of the funun. And from what I understand, in the Kanz al-Daqa'iq, Sharh Kanz al-Daqa'iq, the Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, there are, especially in the Hashia, there are significant material that's alluded to by Al-Zayla'i, Fakhruddin Al-Zayla'i, which is a principle of usuli works, okay? That later on, his student Qadi Simuana will incorporate into his own larger fiqh work, okay? So Imam Fakhruddin Al-Zayla'i, he was known as one of the great ones in the madhab, as illustrated by his ability and mastery of fiqh, hadith, nahu, and fara'id, okay? And this is seen in his Tabyin al-Haqa'iq. He's classed as the 6th tabaqa of the Hanafi jurist, because they put the Hanafi jurist into various tabaqas, and one of there are about 7 that has been mentioned, and he's put into the 6th tabaqa. And it's been mentioned that he was an ascetic person who was very humble, and we can see from his biography, because the way he was very humble, and he didn't bother with focusing on attracting people to him and talking about his opinion of I said this and I said that, you know. It's always said, it's been said, and that sort of thing. This is the language he used, you know. And so he was very humble, and he would say, don't cut short your recitation for my sake, for I see myself like one of you. If you happen to find someone astute in certain science, read to them, so you may gain more good and more benefit. That is much more than what I have to offer. And so this humbleness was really recorded and was mentioned across the board from these scholars who were contemporary to him. Fakhruddin also may have studied with other scholars who were of Zayla at the time, that when he left, such as being Shihabuddin Umar al-Zayla'i al-Uqayli, from the Uqayli tribe, okay? He was an expert in fiqh, he was expert in tasawwuf and nahu and tafsir, and he wrote a book called Thamarat, okay? A book called Thamarat al-Haqiqah. a book called ثمرة الحقيقة, and these books and these works in tasawwuf is what he was famous for at the time. He's also another scholar that he probably studied with was Imam Muhammad ibn Ali al-Zayla'i, who was an expert in fiqh and usul. Some of the works he left behind is Sharh al-Lumma, the Lumma of Imam al-Shirazi, which was probably taken by him and studied and incorporated into his later on fiqh work, that usul fiqh work that he never mentioned, sorry, not managed to publish. And I'm talking about Fakhruddin al-Zayla'i. Okay, and so he was a product of his environment, and he was by then a senior scholar, right? And so he produced scholarships such as Jamaluddin al-Zayla'i, which we'll talk about later on. I'm not going to stand still on him. And then with who wrote the Nasbaraya, the famous hadith expert, scholar. Then he was a teacher of Shamsuddin al-Sa'i al-Nahwi, who was a great scholar in Lugha, and we mentioned Simawana, okay? And he wrote works like Imam Fakhruddin wrote works like Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, Sharh Kanz al-Daqa'iq, and also a work called Sharh ala al-Jami' al-Kabir, which is Imam al-Shaybani's collection of compendium. And then he's also wrote a Sharh on al-Mukhtasar lil-Fatawa, which is a smaller work on what do they call it? The Furu' works in Hanafi fiqh work, okay, by Imam Mawsili. So these are works that he's left behind, and works that he's famous for, and works that he's been celebrated for. And he's reported to have left his native land, Sayla, to settle in Cairo around about 705, where he taught till his death. And this was this raises an important question that as I mentioned earlier on, that he was not a product of the places where he became famous for, but rather where he came from, and his knowledge and exposure came from this part of the world. And obviously places that he went to, he studied and added to it, and then he became a senior scholar that's been celebrated, okay? And these are some of the things that we recognize about him. And so I'm going to push forward in close to the concluding area. Based on my timeline, I have like 5 minutes left. I don't want to keep you too long, and there's a Q&A session probably coming up afterwards. And we have to pray Asr here. And so Jamaluddin, we go to a man called by the name of Jamaluddin, Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Yusuf ibn Yunus ibn Muhammad al-Zayla'i, who was a high-level scholar of hadith, who is known to be from those people who lived in Cairo. And he was celebrated as a hadith expert of his time, and put in the categories of people like Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali and Sayyid al-Nas, people like Zainuddin al-Iraqi, who was a colleague of his, who they traveled together. And while our Jamaluddin al-Zayla'i was compiling his work, his fundamental work in hadith takhrij, by the name of Nasbaraya, Imam Zainuddin al-Iraqi was compiling his takhrij of the Ihya Ulumuddin, okay? And so these people are people who were celebrated and widely, this individual person was celebrated. And so he studied with Hafiz al-Mizzi, he studied with Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, he studied with al-Maradini, okay? And in fiqh, he studied with Fakhruddin al-Zayla'i, who we mentioned earlier on, and some sources mention Fakhruddin al-Zayla'i being somewhat his maternal uncle. And in Lugha, he mentioned that he studied with Baha'uddin and Abdurrahman ibn Aqil, right? The grammarian, the one who wrote the Alfiyat, Sharh, the famous Alfiyat of Alfiyat ibn Malik, okay? And so, so the heritage of Jamaluddin al-Zaili, I don't need to emphasize, and I know maybe some of it might be new to us, but in Nasb al-Raya, anybody who knows Hadith science and Hadith Takhrij knows the importance of it and the extensiveness that, and the thing, the labor that he puts in tracing each Hadith that was used and in Hidayah. Hidayah is where this fiqh Hadith work that's produced for the Hanafis. Okay, now Al-Mirghanani, by Al-Mirghanani, if I'm not mistaken. So this is what he goes in an extensive effort on each hadith to trace its various paths and to talk about these paths and have a comment on it, okay? And he's been mentioned that he is a critical person in terms of Takhrij al-Hadith, so much so that Qut al-Bugha says the most expansive in scope and wide-ranging in collection is the Nasb al-Raya of Imam Jamaluddin al-Zaili, and Imam al-Laknawi, the sub-Indian or sub-Asian continent hadith scholar, he also mentions that this his takhrij work is indicative of his depth in the field of hadith and narrative criticism, and his encompassing vision in the branches of hadith to the highest extent that Mufti and Sheikh Mohammed Zahid al-Kawthari mentions that his takhrij works bear testimony to his depth and expansive scope in the disciplines of hadith in terms of commentary and narrator criticism and text and roots. And Sheikh Anwar Shah Kashmiri, and anybody knows Kashmiri's position in terms of hadith in modern sciences and modern hadith sciences. He mentions, he says, in my opinion, Hafiz al-Zailai or Jamaluddin al-Zailai in this case has better memory than Hafiz ibn Hajar. That's a claim and half. This is what Sheikh Muhammad al-Awwama puts forward, and he says that what Sheikh Kashmiri mentions, and that is a person of that caliber, and we know the level of his knowledge and the level of his takhrij. And I've been also told, and this is an anecdote, I don't have something to back it up, and I shouldn't say it, but still, the persons I heard from are reliable people that I've heard, that even Sheikh Nasiruddin al-Albani was mentioned to have said that there is no takhrij except the takhrij of Jamaluddin al-Zailai, and i.e. mentioning here sort of a famous anecdote that there is no fath except the fath of the Fath al-Bari of when it came to the Sahih Bukhari of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And this is also another comparison to Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and we know in the tabaqat level of Ilm al-Rajal and Takhrij works where Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani stands, whether we agree with it or not. And so I'm going to skip through this section because I don't have much to add, because I've already given you the exposure of the scholarship in that part of the world, and where people came from and their level of knowledge. Okay, and we mentioned earlier on that the states that came there. Okay, so, and it's one of the things that we also do not appreciate when we talk about knowledge production and literature from that part of the world is that East Africa, as much as West Africa and Central Africa, as what we know as the Sub-Saharan Africa, the literature in terms of written material have been not same level as the, say, the Arabian Peninsula or the Indian, South Asian part of the world, or the Persian part of the world, for the simple reason that many of these cultures did not have a written literature culture. but that does not mean they did not produce later on rich in literature, like the Ajami material that we have. And the Ajami materials is really widely studied and widely produced in nowadays, alhamdulillah, in West Africa. And there's a lot of stuff coming out of the woodwork because people are showing interest. It's not that it's been not present. It's just people have not been interested in. But alhamdulillah, people are going back to their roots and trying to understand where this knowledge and Islamic heritage comes from, right? And so these Ajami sources are really important in giving us an image on what Islam in Africa was like and how indigenous it was, rather than putting labels that were itinerary scholars that came from either Arabian Peninsula or Asian continent or Persia, and which is not to deny that happened, but it's not the narrative within the realm of the world, okay? And so the Ajami script is very important. Again, it's not widely studied in East Africa. The Ajami sources have very untapped mines of information. We have sources and books and materials that date in the first century, second century, stuff that have unfortunately been lost now, but has been mentioned in sources and references that we've had and people who've studied at the time. In the 90s, we had, and this is mentioned in anybody who wants later on, I'll provide this reference. I didn't put it in the slides, but one of the scholars who was doing his PhD in Somalia and who graduated in Sudan, he mentioned that he studied and went to a literature review, the Makhtuta, and he came across several manuscripts which were ancient, like tracing a century or 2 centuries after the Hijrah, okay? And so, and some are Ajami, some is our poetry, some is these things that people like to regurgitate and bring out again and again, and that's not bad, it gives us lessons and stuff, but the expertise of hadith and fiqh stuff are not really studied and mentioned. And so the Ajami is one of the excellent format that people have used. They constitute important and unique part of the Islamic component of the African library, says one of the scholars who actually wrote about this subject, okay? This screenshot that I have is a recent, it's a century old, it's not much, but this is, there are others, like I said, much older than that, which I didn't put here. But this shows in terms of Ajami script, Somali language being utilized. And we have, again, Somali language letters being utilized and written in Arabic format that people and scholars have communicated with, okay? And this is in Somali Ajami writing, a text written by a husband to his wife about a century ago, both actually living in 2 different parts of the, what we know now Somaliland area, Berbera and Bur'a areas respectively. And basically just chit-chatting, as it were, a long distance telephone call, as it were, you know? And so this is the culture and the things that people have produced. And the people have actually traveled to these centers. One of the famous anecdote, I'll conclude in the next 5 minutes, please. Apologize that I've been taking too long. I know it started also slightly bit late. So we know through the scholarship, not only that left the part of the world, but scholarship actually that we mentioned earlier on, that's traveled from the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the South Asia, that have come and lived and or moved back to their neck of the wood and taught people and spread Islam, right? Okay. And so these included people like Imam and Habib, Mohammed ibn Alawi, ibn Ahmed al-Faqih al-Muqaddam, in roundabout, who was roundabout in the time of 640, roughly 650. It's been mentioned 650 something, 650, 660 roughly, that he came and studied with a scholar that was resident and is buried in Mogadishu at the time, was Jamaluddin Muhammad ibn Abdul Samad al-Jahwi. And al-Jahwi is one of those people who've been teaching the Shafi'i fiqh in that part of the world extensively, okay? And so people know that. and the reputation for people to have that you need to study is the same thing as a reputation that develops over a period of time, that you can go to there and study that book and you could get a good scholar who's mastered in that science or has a sanat or who is the probably most disciplined. And they say that Habib here, Sheikh Habib al-Muhammad ibn Alawi, the great grandson of Al-Faqih al-Muqaddim, the famous Imam of the Ba'alawis in Yemen, they say he is the one that brought back the Tanbih and various others back to South Yemen, okay? And so it's been said that he read to him the Muhaddab, the Tanbih, the Wasit, the Wajiz in 1 year. So this shows you the speed of the knowledge, the transfers of the knowledge, and the seniority of the ilm, that such a celebrated works of that has just been around maybe 50 years in different parts of the world. Because if you look at some of these books, between them and the authors that wrote them, the Muhaddab is by Shirazi, and the Tanbih is by Shirazi, both by Shirazi, and Shirazi died 476 Hijri, okay? And the Wasit and Al-Wajiz is by Al-Ghazali, who died, when did he die? Was it 1000 something CE? Basically, short while, 5th century Hijri, right? Short while after Imam Shirazi. And this shows you that these sciences were really important, and people came to study there, and people came to learn and bring back the knowledge. And the same thing is being mentioned by Ibn Battuta when he comes to, again, that part of the world in 731. He said he visited a century later when Jahwi was there. He says educational institutes are massive. He actually, Ibn Battuta, stayed and lived in the student dormant of the masjid, because he stayed in the Jami' Masjid, and he was hosted by the Qadi of Mogadishu. And so because he was hosted by the Qadi of the Mogadishu, that meant the Qadi of the Mogadishu, and what was tied with the Darul Iftar was the masjid where people actually come to dars for fatwa, for learning. And he stayed as such the student dormat, and the student dormat was completely free and paid by the waqf, as he mentioned, and by the state and the sultan. And the sultan at the time was actually ironically known as a sheikh. He's not someone known by sultan, so he's not called a sultan. They called them sheikh, and this is what something Ibn Battuta mentioned, obviously distinctively linking here knowledge and ilm over to the title of authority. Okay, and so and again we know about through the manuscripts and makhtut works that are available, that less than 2 decades in Aden, that there are scholars living in Mogadishu transporting and exporting makhtut works. Like, for example, like the story of Sheikh Kamaluddin al-Maqdishi, who was a person who was a tradesman who lived by trading and selling various things. He sold livestock, but he also sold, among other things, the manuscripts that have been orally produced in Mogadishu and areas and Kilwa and the Swahili part of the world, and he exported it back to Yemen and Asia. And you have to understand why, because there's some sort of a boycott going on between the current rulers, the contemporary rulers in Yemen, and the Hijazi rulers of the time. Okay, so it's been said that the Qadis from Mogadishu were strongly involved in the trade of books. So there is quite a link with the trade of books, just like there is one in Western Africa, in the makhtut works, and people traveling between Maghrib and Mali to produce a simple copy of Qadi's Shifa. You know, you paid arm and leg to get a Qadi Shifa produced online and beautifully. and exported. People paid arm and leg, and this is what some of the contemporary historians and scholars mention in West Africa, right? And the same thing goes with some of the fiqh works that were available at the time in East Africa, okay? And so Imam al-Maghrizi then also mentions that a century later as well, that roughly a century later, just before he died, that he met in Mecca, where he stayed last 4 years of his life, roughly, before he passed away, that he met a Qadi from Lamu, Lamu, what is modern day Kenya, who came from Qadi of Lamu, but originally was from Mogadishu, of the Barawani scholars, that he came to Lamu and he spent time with him and he interviewed him as he was compiling his work on historical works in East Africa and the scholars and Islamic Sheikh. This is the work that I was translating, as I mentioned, but also that he studied with him, okay? That the Sheikh was a knowledgeable scholar and Qadi, and he studied with him, right? And he said he was Muhammad ibn Ishaq was a judge of Lamu, which is one of the Zenj coastal towns of the Barabar Sea, where Barabar Sea was known as the Somali coast at the time, located west to the city of Mogadishu, he said. While I was in Mecca, he arrived for Hajj, and in the concluding year of 839, he spent time with him and studied with him. And he says, Sakhawi says, verbatim, after quoting him with similar lines, okay, that he was born in 787, that this sheikh was born in 787 roughly. And Maghrizi then follows that up and says, I was tested by him in my knowledge of fiqh in the Shafi'i madhab and inheritance and fara'id. And just shows you that the reputation a century ago that we were just talking about earlier has not subsidized, that these works of Hawi, Tanbih, Muhaddab, Shirazi, of Shirazi, and all these works have still and continue to be critical, crucial to be studied from these people from that part of the world, okay? And so most of the education centers were dotted around the Horn of Africa, as well as East Africa, as well as these parts of the world. And Wollo was one of these centers of Islamic learning. It really dates longer than what we superficially take it as granted. We always talk about that it dates back to the 15th, 16th century, which would put the 10th century Hijri or 9th century Hijri, but it predates that much longer because Islam has been there much longer, and therefore the studies that has been conducted has been very superficial, except what Dr. Ahmed has done in terms of Islamic heritage and Islamic seminaries in that part of the world. It's been mentioned that Mufti, subhanAllah, Mufti Adam, I wish I had the book, but there's Mufti Daoud Afun. Mufti Daoud is one of the most foundational scholars of the last century or so, who is basically the father of modern Wollo Islamic Seminary, and who distributed the knowledge. He boasts so much asanid in the almost all of the hadith works that are available, and the chain of transmission he's had is phenomenal. There's been works produced in, I think, two works in terms of his and other scholars of that part of the center of the world that are critical to their ilm and their transmission, continuing all around the world and their chain of transmissions, okay? So it has been collected. And these centers are some of the centers that have been probably revived and not are brand new, because a lot of people will say they are brand new and founded by these scholars, but in reality, they might have been revived and continued of that way. And so these centers are found in Wollo, for example, and many other places. And the Hanafi and the Shafi'i fiqh work, madhab is very strong in that part of the world as well. And we will talk about it later on, inshallah, in the Q&A session. And so Islam was introduced into Wollo from Ifad's northern eastern Shawa, where it had flourished, it says here, since the 11th century, if not earlier. And I believe in what Dr. Hassan here is saying, that it is earlier, and the data, specifically the Muslim sources data that we have, are consistent about it in this regard, okay? And the biographical works that we have. So it was estimated that in one time in the Somali Peninsula alone, that there were 80 Islamic seminary communities functioning in one area of the world. I'm talking about just one area of East Africa, not the Northern East Africa, not the Swahili coast, not that, just a little tiny strip of, well, it's not that tiny, but that piece of the Somali Peninsula. And so I can only mention here names, if I, sorry, I went farther. Places that I know have been very critical in terms of spreading the knowledge of Islam, right? Of Islam in the past, I don't know, past couple of centuries, okay? And so they are very important, and such as these centers are there. I'll leave it there, inshallah, so that we can focus on it and have a look at it. They are across Northeast Africa, they are across Swahili coast, they are across Somali Peninsula, okay, and they are very crucial to the spread of Islam throughout that part of the world, and they have been consistently producing Islamic scholars across the board, okay? And I know it's 7:20 now. We were
Ustadh, can I just request you to reshare the screen? I think it's just gone off on when you were switching the slides.
Yeah, oh, okay. Okay. Let me look at it. Give me a second. Where is this? Yeah, okay. Share screen. Sorry, I thought I shared it back on again.
Brilliant, Jazakallah.
Yeah, so can we see? I think we can see, right?
Yes, we can see it now, Jazakallah.
And so it was these places that, if I go in just 2 minutes, Wallo, we mentioned a bit of it. Dara is within the Shawak district of Northeast Ethiopia, modern day. Fiqh is what the Somalis live in modern day Ethiopia. Raso is the same thing. Harar, I don't need to introduce Harar, is known as the third haram. Literally people knew it as third haram because it was not permissible for non-Muslims to enter. And this is because it was center of Islamic learning. So the leadership and the Muslim learners, they said, we do not want to introduce kufr and kufar in here. So there was no non-Muslims allowed for centuries, until in the 18th century, something, 1850s and 1860s. Some Europeans went there under the disguise of being Muslim, among them being Richard Burton in 1850 something. He went there to look at this romantic town, he called it. And so you've got these other towns which are in the Somali district, which are ancient again. Some of them we mentioned earlier on. Then you've got the Swahili coast as well. Lamu is very important. Kilwa boasts one of the oldest masajids, complicated infrastructure, early on built probably 2nd century Hijri, 150 Hijri roughly. Marka, Barawe, Mombasa, the Banadir areas, Mogadishu, all of these things, all of these places have masajids that are very old, that their foundations have been renewed. But if you look at architecturally, the foundations that have been studied, they tend to date 1,000 or 1,100 years, as well as the graveyards that are near it, you know, because, you know, it's been the culture that Muslims, wherever they go, if the alim dies near a center that he was known as, he would be buried next to it. And this has been the culture. And we have burial sites near Mogadishu that date around about 150 Hijri, 149 Hijri. So I'm going to conclude there. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to say in the next 2 minutes, how did all of this go in the dark then? How come that all this tradition, all this knowledge, all these snippets of things and windows that I've been talking to you guys about, how come this is not the dominant story? How come this is not what is known? Well, something happened in the 1490s that was called the European expansion, okay? So the Europeans under the Portuguese and the Spaniards left the Iberian Peninsula, and they discovered that route around the Cape of Hope, which is South Africa, to go to and disrupt the trade and the monopoly that Muslims had for millennia on the trade of the Silk Road, as well as the trade route of the Indian Ocean. So once that happened, the consequence was to ruin all these trading coastal towns to smithereens. So it was bombarded, it was destroyed. The Portuguese did a century-long campaign of utterly destroying East Africa, bombardments after bombardments, and the consistency of bombardments. We have records only that Zaila alone has been burnt and destroyed over 17 times. Zaila today is a dust. And there's the same Zaila we were talking about for the past 2 hours. That it's nothing if you go to it today. You wouldn't want to spend there for a day or a week, as it were. It's too hot. It's nothing. There's nothing going on, and it's no trading going on. There's no knowledge going on. There's absolutely it's being completely ruined. And this is something that has happened. And the destruction was not unique to East Africa. It happened to the Indian subcontinent. It happened in the Muslim areas of China and the Muslim settlements. It happens into what is known as the Red Sea and everything else, until the Ottomans' naval power came into play. When the Ottoman naval power came into play, that supremacy of almost century-long not having anybody to compete with you went out the window, because the Ottoman now became the dominant factor in the Islamic world, but also built a massive a flotilla of army on the oceans and the seas, and they have basically put a stop to the Portuguese destructions and mayhem. Okay, and when I say destruction and mayhem, I'm really the word does not do the action does not do the words justice, because it was there is nothing to describe with. If you look at the data and the information and the things that they even wrote, those people who were there, the things that they saw, the beauty, the infrastructure, the complicated networks that Muslims had across the world, across ethnicities, the knowledge transfer, the buildings. One of the guys who saw Mogadishu when they came for the first time, he said, I didn't know whether I was looking at jewels, large jewels that hit the sun ray as the morning sun came up, or whether I was looking at buildings, because the buildings infrastructure had 3-4 layers. They had 3-4 floors, and it was completely built, and it had amazing networks, sewage networks, and we can talk about these things. And same thing with Kilwa. If you look at it, they're till today amazed at how these people built their sewages, how they built their water passageways. The Ajuran, the same thing, how they built their military infrastructure to the point where they had women regiments, subhanAllah. So at this time, in terms of understanding of what the history showed us at that time period, is an utter destruction. So we have a period of 300-400 years where everything's been burnt, just like the Tatar and the Mongols did to the Abbasids and the much of the Mamluk era, and they destroyed Makhtuts, and they threw all the manuscripts in the Tigris River and the Nile, to the point where people said the rivers flowed black because of the ink and the amount of manuscripts were thrown in it, or sometimes through the color of it became red because of the blood of the people that have been massacred, specifically scholars. Okay, this pain that is felt through the Muslim world, it's not only unique into that part of the world where we just mentioned, when the Tatar and the Mongols invaded, although that has been extensively studied by Muslims and non-Muslims. Unfortunately, it's not to the same amount or same passion has not been studied, the destruction that has been caused by the Portuguese and the European hegemony there in the Indian Ocean, as well as the Eastern African Islamic heritage that has been there, and the destruction that has been caused by these powers. And obviously, as things happen, people moved out the cities and they moved on, and people became somewhat, some of them were already pastoralists and nomad, and people became part of that. They moved into new cities and settlements, and they built new cities and settlements in the hinterlands and deep into the countryside, and da'wah spread that way and that sort of things. But it wasn't the norm until this vacuum came. And that's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that people became lax themselves. You know, the ilm has become very lax, and we see this again through the Arabian Peninsula. We see this through the Mughal Empire in India, where everything was about fancifulness. Money was spent on paintings and beautification of palaces. You know, that beautiful palace that is essentially a graveyard, a mausoleum dedicated to a woman that the Amir, King loved. You know, this extravagance became the norm, and so that was the backstory. Okay, this is the same thing with East Africa as well, and this became also the norm, and this is what has killed the Muslim society generally, and this is what has continued until obviously, and Ibn Kathir mentions in his tafsir again and again that the Tatar and the Mongol in Dimashq and in Cairo was as a consequence of us lacking behind, he says, you know. And one of the modern scholars, when he talks about and studies the tabaqat works and how the tabaqat works were produced at that time period, he says, why? Because Muslim scholars kept dying. They kept dying out like flies. They kept being killed. They kept being leaving. Their appreciation was not really much existent. So many scholars start thinking, we need to start writing tabaqat now. You know, we need to, and the conflicts was very widely spread at the time, okay? And so because that happened, this is one of the arguments anyway, and I don't want to labor that topic, and this is a really interesting topic as well if we look at the correlation of these things, inshallah, and I'll keep it to there, and I'll pass the mic on back to Brother Hudhaifa, inshallah, and we can deal with the Q&A session, bi'idhnillah kareem.